November 1993, Seattle. Courtney Love wrote a single line in her journal, and that line remained hidden for 23 years. Sometimes, I want to see him dead. A single sentence, one sentence, and 5 months later, Kurt Cobain would be found dead. Police collected this journal from the house, weeks after Kurt's death, added it to the file, but never leaked it to the media. Seattle Police Department file number SPD 94172CL carried a note on its cover, high profile, not for public release. When portions were disclosed in 2016 under Freedom of Information laws, the world erupted. Because that sentence wasn't alone. There were pages full of violence, hopelessness, death fantasies. But the real question emerged immediately. Was this a murder plan, or was it the internal scream of a desperate woman? Conspiracy theorists declared it evidence. Psychologists called it a cry for help. Lawyers said it was taken out of context. But the truth proved far more complex. Because in that journal, it wasn't just Courtney's voice. Kurt's voice was there too. Some pages were written in Kurt's handwriting. Some lines were their shared thoughts. And the most disturbing detail, both of them were writing about death. Both saw the end coming. Both were walking toward the inevitable conclusion. The question that haunts everyone who has seen the complete journal is this: if police had read it while Kurt was still alive, could they have saved him? Or was it already too late? The Black Notebook had been with Courtney since 1989, long before she met Kurt Cobain. It was a journal, but also something more chaotic, a space where she wrote song lyrics for Hole, sketched ideas for album covers, pasted in photographs and concert tickets, and documented her innermost thoughts without filter. The pages were filled with different colored inks, different handwriting styles, depending on her mood or level of intoxication, and absolutely no dates on most entries, making it nearly impossible to establish a clear timeline. By the time Kurt entered her life in 1990, the journal had become a confessional space where Courtney could be brutally honest. She wrote about her ambitions, her insecurities, her rage at the music industry, and eventually her complicated feelings about the man who would become her husband. The journal followed her through the whirlwind romance, through their chaotic wedding in Hawaii in 1992, through Frances Bean's birth and the subsequent custody battle, through police visits and rehab attempts, and the slow unraveling of their marriage. And in November 1993, approximately 5 months before Kurt's death, she opened the journal and wrote a single line that would become the most analyzed sentence in rock history. November 17, 1993. That date appears at the top of page 23, one of the few entries Courtney actually dated. The night before, Kurt had performed at MTV Unplugged in New York, a stripped-down acoustic set that would later be recognized as one of the most hauntingly beautiful performances of his career. But during the taping, Courtney watched from backstage as Kurt struggled. He was pale, shaking, clearly in pain from the stomach condition that had plagued him since adolescence. Between songs, he rushed to the bathroom to vomit. The crew whispered about whether he could finish the set. Courtney stood in the wings, watching the man she loved suffer on stage, and felt something inside her break. They flew back to Seattle the next day in silence. Kurt went straight to bed. Frances was with a babysitter, and Courtney, alone in the kitchen of their house on Lake Washington Boulevard, pulled out her journal and began to write. The entry started with descriptions of the MTV taping, observations about how sick Kurt looked, frustration that nobody was helping him. Then, halfway down the page, she wrote the sentence that would follow her forever. Sometimes, I want to see him dead. But that sentence didn't end there. The entry continued for 2 more pages, and the context completely changes the meaning. Sometimes I want to see him dead, not because I hate him. I love him more than I've ever loved anyone or anything, but because I can't watch this anymore. Every single day I wake up and wonder if today is the day I get the call. Every time the phone rings, my heart stops. Every time there's a knock at the door, I think it's the police coming to tell me he's gone. I'm not living. I'm just waiting for him to die, and the waiting is killing me. Maybe if it just happened, if he just did it already, at least the torture of waiting would be over. Does that make me evil? Probably. But I don't know how else to feel anymore. I've tried everything. Rehab, begging, threatening, hiding the drugs, hiding the guns. Nothing works. He wants to die, and I can't stop him. And I'm so tired. I'm so tired of fighting a battle. I can't win. The entry reveals not a woman plotting murder, but a woman experiencing what psychologists call anticipatory grief, the grief that occurs before a loss when you know it's coming and can't prevent it. The journal sat in that house for the next 5 months as the situation deteriorated. Kurt's drug use intensified. His talk of suicide became more frequent and more specific. In March 1994, he overdosed in Rome and spent 20 hours in a coma, an incident officially called accidental, but that people close to the couple knew was a suicide attempt. When they returned to Seattle, Kurt went to rehab but left after less than 2 days. In early April, Courtney hired private investigator Tom Grant to find Kurt, who had gone missing. On April 3rd, Seattle police confiscated guns from the house after Courtney reported Kurt was suicidal. And on April 5, 1994, Kurt Cobain died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound in the greenhouse above his garage. His body wasn't discovered until April 8. The death was quickly ruled a suicide based on overwhelming evidence: the suicide note, the gun, the heroin in his system, the history of attempts. But conspiracy theories began immediately, fueled by people who couldn't accept that Kurt had killed himself, who needed someone to blame and who found a convenient target in Courtney Love. 8 days after Kurt's body was discovered, Seattle Police Detective Antonio Terry entered the house to conduct a final evidence sweep. In the master bedroom, he opened Courtney's nightstand drawer and found the black journal. He flipped through it and immediately recognized what he was holding: years of intimate thoughts about Kurt, about their marriage, about death. Terry sat on the edge of the bed and began reading carefully, and within 20 minutes he understood he had a problem. Not because the journal contained evidence of crime, but because it contained words that could easily be taken out of context by a public desperate for answers and conspiracy theorists desperate for proof. On page 23, he found the entry dated November 17, 1993. Detective Terry read that entry multiple times, then continued through the entire journal, finding similar passages scattered throughout, references to waiting for Kurt's death, expressions of exhaustion from trying to save him, imagining what life would be like as a widow, dark thoughts about whether Frances would be better off without a suicidal father. But Terry also found love letters to Kurt, angry rants about his drug dealers, desperate pleas for him to get help, and entries showing Courtney's own suicidal ideation. Most significantly, Terry noticed that some pages weren't in Courtney's handwriting at all. They were in Kurt's. Several entries were written by Kurt himself, documenting his own thoughts about suicide, about pain, about whether his family would be better off without him. This wasn't just Courtney's journal. It had become a shared space where both of them processed the approaching tragedy. Terry made photocopies of key pages, sealed the original journal in an evidence bag, and wrote in his report dated April 20, 1994. Journal recovered from master bedroom nightstand, contains entries from approximately 1989 through early April 1994. Multiple entries reference subject Cobain's suicidal ideation and subject Love's awareness of same. Some entries written in subject Cobain's handwriting. Journal shows both subjects processing anticipated suicide. No evidence of homicidal planning or criminal conspiracy. Recommend sealing due to high-profile nature of case and potential for misinterpretation by media and public. That recommendation was accepted. The journal was filed as evidence, marked as restricted access, and placed in secure storage. A note was attached: high profile, not for public release. Privacy concerns. For 22 years the journal remained there, known to only a handful of people. The detectives who worked the case, a few supervisors who reviewed the file periodically, and the attorneys who represented the department. Courtney apparently forgot about it, or perhaps assumed it had been returned. She never mentioned the journal's existence in interviews, never referenced the police having it, and seemed unaware that her most private thoughts were sitting in an evidence locker. The journal might have stayed hidden forever, if not for a combination of bureaucratic process and one person's decision to make unauthorized copies. In 2015, a Seattle-based investigative journalist filed a Freedom of Information request for documents related to celebrity death investigations in the 1990s. The request was broad, covering multiple deaths. The Seattle Police Department's legal compliance team began reviewing files to determine what could be released. An archives specialist was assigned to review the Cobain case file. As he worked through boxes of materials, he came across the sealed journal. The note said not for public release, but the specialist was curious. He opened the evidence bag and began reading, and within minutes he understood why it had been sealed. What happened next remains disputed, but the outcome is clear. Someone made unauthorized copies of several journal pages. According to the official investigation conducted after the leak, the archives specialist made photocopies of approximately 15 pages, including the November 17, 1993 entry with the explosive opening line. He claimed later that he made the copies as part of the standard review process, intending to redact personal information before determining if anything could be released. But the copies he made were unredacted, and those copies somehow left the police department. What is certain is that by February 2016, copies were circulating among people connected to the conspiracy theory community. Tom Grant, the private investigator who has spent 30 years claiming Kurt was murdered, received copies in early March. And on March 15, 2016, selected pages from Courtney's journal appeared on multiple conspiracy theory websites simultaneously, with the headline, "Courtney's Murder Journal Finally Exposed." The internet exploded within hours. The phrase, "sometimes I want to see him dead," trended worldwide. News outlets picked up the story immediately. Conspiracy theory forums, that had been relatively quiet for years, suddenly filled with activity. Tom Grant released a video statement, calling the journal the evidence we've been waiting for 22 years, and arguing that it showed premeditation. Multiple online petitions demanding a new investigation gathered hundreds of thousands of signatures within days. Cable news ran segments debating whether the journal entries constituted proof of murder, and Courtney Love, blindsided by the leak, immediately went into crisis mode, with her attorneys filing emergency motions to stop further dissemination, and her publicist releasing a statement calling the leak a grotesque violation of privacy and saying the entries were being deliberately misrepresented. But the damage was done. The journal pages were everywhere, and the narrative was set. Courtney had wanted Kurt dead. The leaked pages had been carefully selected to support that narrative. They included the November 17th entry with its explosive opening line, but not the full context. They included an undated entry where Courtney wrote, "I imagine myself as a widow sometimes," but not the surrounding entries where she wrote about wanting to die with Kurt. They included a fragment from early 1994 where she wrote, "I'm tired of waiting for it to happen," but not the next sentence where she clarified she meant waiting for him to go through with suicide. The leak was strategic, designed to make Courtney look as guilty as possible while hiding anything that might exonerate her. Public opinion shifted dramatically. Polls showed that after the journal leak, nearly 60% of people believed there was something suspicious about Kurt's death, up from about 40% before. Courtney suddenly found herself defending against accusations all over again, this time with her own words being used as evidence. The Seattle Police Department's response was swift, but ultimately ineffective. An internal investigation was launched to determine who had leaked the pages. The archives specialist was placed on administrative leave and questioned extensively. He admitted to making photocopies, but denied leaking them. Investigators found no direct evidence linking him to the leak. He was reprimanded for making unauthorized copies and eventually resigned, but no criminal charges were filed. Meanwhile, the police department released a statement on March 18, 2016. "We are aware that portions of a journal belonging to Courtney Love have been unlawfully disclosed. We are investigating the source of this leak. However, we want to be clear, this journal was reviewed thoroughly by detectives in 1994 and found to contain no evidence of criminal activity. The entries show a woman processing an extremely difficult situation. Taking these entries out of context to suggest murder is both factually wrong and deeply unfair." But conspiracy theorists weren't satisfied. The online movement demanding a new investigation grew larger and more organized. A group calling themselves Justice for Kurt raised money for billboards in Seattle, organized protests outside police headquarters, and hired their own forensic experts. Tom Grant appeared on dozens of podcasts, arguing that the journal proved Courtney had been fantasizing about Kurt's death for months, which demonstrated premeditation. He pointed to several entries as particularly damning, but Grant's interpretation required ignoring the full context, which showed a woman exhausted from years of trying to prevent the suicide she knew was coming, not a woman planning to cause it. The most significant revelation that emerged from careful analysis was that Kurt had written in the journal too. This fact was mentioned in Detective Terry's 1994 report, but hadn't been widely known. Several pages were entirely in Kurt's handwriting, confirmed as authentic by handwriting experts. One entry dated January 15, 1994, less than 3 months before his death, is particularly significant. I think about it every day now, how I would do it. Where the greenhouse may be, or the garage. I know what it would do to C and to Francis, but I can't keep living like this. The pain is too much. The drugs don't work anymore. Nothing works. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, but I can't stay just because you need me to. That's not fair to me. This entry in Kurt's own hand describing his own suicidal planning should have ended the conspiracy theories immediately. But conspiracy theorists simply adapted, some claiming the entry was forged, others arguing that even if Kurt had written about suicide, it didn't mean he actually committed it. Dr. Patricia Langston, a clinical psychologist specializing in trauma and grief, reviewed the available journal entries in 2017 for a documentary. Her professional assessment contradicted the conspiracy narrative entirely. What we see in these journal entries is a textbook example of anticipatory grief combined with caregiver burnout, Dr. Langston explained. Courtney was living in a constant state of crisis for years, knowing her husband was going to kill himself, unable to prevent it, watching it happen in slow motion. The thought sometimes I want him to die, so the suffering ends is actually very common in people experiencing anticipatory grief. It doesn't indicate homicidal intent, it indicates psychological exhaustion. Dr. Langston also noted that Courtney's entries about imagining herself as a widow were consistent with someone trying to mentally prepare for an inevitable loss. And most significantly, the entries showing both Kurt and Courtney writing about his impending death demonstrated that they were both processing the same reality together. But psychological analysis couldn't compete with the power of the conspiracy narrative online. YouTube videos analyzing the journal entries accumulated tens of millions of views, Reddit threads dissected every word, Facebook groups dedicated to exposing the truth swelled with new members, and the harassment of Courtney intensified dramatically. She received death threats, was confronted by conspiracy theorists in public, and had to increase security. In one particularly disturbing incident, in late 2016, a man was arrested outside her Los Angeles residence carrying a gun and a manifesto about bringing justice for Kurt. The man claimed he had read the journal entries and decided Courtney needed to pay for what she did. This radicalization from online theorizing to real-world violence highlighted the dangerous consequences of the journal leak. Courtney gave one interview about the journal to Rolling Stone magazine in December 2016, and her words were raw. "Those entries were stolen from me. They were my private thoughts during the worst period of my life. Yes, I had dark thoughts, but that's what you think when you're watching someone you love destroy themselves and you can't stop them. It doesn't make me a murderer. It makes me human." Frances Bean Cobain, who was barely 2 years old when her father died, addressed the journal controversy in a 2018 interview. Her perspective was measured and compassionate. "I've read the journal entries, all of them, not just the ones that were leaked, and what I see is two sick people who loved each other, but couldn't save each other. My mother's entries show someone who was drowning. My father's entries show someone who had decided to die. That's not a murder story. That's a tragedy. And taking my mother's worst moments and using them to call her a murderer is cruel and wrong." Frances has become an advocate for more nuanced discussions of mental health, addiction, and suicide. She has also called for the remaining sealed portions of the journal to stay sealed, arguing that not everything needs to be public just because people are curious. The question of whether the journal should have ever been released remains contentious. Some argue that as a historical document related to one of music's most significant figures, it should be available for public examination. Others argue that it was private property, that its leak violated Courtney's privacy rights, that the public's curiosity doesn't override an individual's right to keep their darkest thoughts private. Legal scholars generally agree that the leak was illegal, but that prosecuting anyone would be nearly impossible. From an ethical standpoint, most privacy advocates and mental health professionals argue that the leak was wrong, that it caused real harm, and that the benefits of public knowledge don't justify the cost of that harm. The truth about Courtney's journal is simpler and sadder than conspiracy theories suggest. It's the documentation of a woman watching her husband commit slow-motion suicide over years, trying desperately to stop it, failing in processing her grief and exhaustion the only way she knew how. The entries show love mixed with rage, hope mixed with resignation, and yes, sometimes dark thoughts about whether death would bring relief. These are normal human responses to an impossible situation. They're not evidence of murder, they're evidence of trauma. But in the age of internet conspiracy theories, where complexity is reduced to simple narratives of heroes and villains, where context is stripped away, the journal has been transformed from a document of grief into supposed proof of guilt. And Courtney Love, who has spent 30 years grieving her husband while being accused of killing him, now has to live with the knowledge that her own words, stolen and taken out of context, are being used as ammunition by people who have decided she's guilty, regardless of evidence. 30 years after Kurt Cobain's death, the debate continues. The journal that was meant to remain sealed forever is now dissected by millions. That single devastating sentence has become shorthand for guilt in the minds of conspiracy theorists. And Courtney remains trapped in a nightmare, where her grief is treated as evidence. If there's a lesson, it's about the danger of reducing complex human experiences to simple narratives, about the cruelty of using someone's private pain as entertainment, and about the need to understand suicide not as a mystery to be solved, but as a tragedy to be prevented. Kurt Cobain was suicidal. Multiple people knew it. Multiple people tried to help. Despite everyone's efforts, he died by his own hand. The journal doesn't change that reality. It just documents how painful that reality was for everyone involved. That's not as dramatic as conspiracy theories suggest, but it's the truth.